You've landed inside Launch Street, the Business Innovation Podcast, where we interview top innovators out there shaking things up so you can innovate, differentiate, and get further faster. Since you're here, we know you're the type of person that recognizes the importance of unlocking your innovation advantage so you can compete and win. And now, your host, the person that has worked with leading companies like Disney, Procter & Gamble, Aero Electronics, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Red Robin on upping their innovation advantage, Tamara Gontor.
Welcome to this week's episode of Inside Launch Street. Tamara here, your host. It is always a blast bringing you value and insight that hopefully helps you go further, faster, and maybe even in a different direction. Have I ever shared with you the definition of innovation that we at Launch Street use with our clients? I want to share that with you because it's one that demystifies innovation. It gets it out of the hands of the select few and into the hands of the many, the rest of us tasked with doing the work every day. Those of us that need to think a little bit differently. The definition is this: thinking differently about what's right in front of you to create an advantage. Not so hard, right? Everybody can do it. Our clients that infuse this definition into the DNA of their teams get incredible results. Why? Because it makes innovation accessible. So I want you to think about it for yourself today. As you go through your day, all I want you to think about is, hey, how do I think differently about what's right in front of me to create an advantage? And that advantage could be a different solution, a different way to look at something, a new perspective, a better process, a new marketing idea, whatever it is. Just think a little bit differently about what's right in front of you. And if you need tools to do that, of course, go to our website, go to Launch Street, and pull up any of the myriad of tools that we have there for you. I just want to make innovation accessible for all of us. Sort of like today's guest that I think makes innovation actionable. So Tristan Kromer is a lean startup coach and founder of Kromatic. He works with innovation teams to run at least one experiment per week to improve their product and business model. And he works with teams and leaders within large companies to build innovation ecosystems. I think you're going to find our entire conversation around the whys and hows of experimentation fascinating. So I get him to break it down to the very fundamentals of why it's so valuable and how to do it in a way that's not overwhelming. I think if you have heard me in any of my keynote speeches around the globe or just any of my work, you know that I'm a big proponent of building a culture of experimentation, getting away from this culture of presentation. Experimentation is when we learn about what really works and what doesn't work. It's how we optimize. It's how real innovation happens. So why don't we dig in and figure out how all of us can build a culture of experimentation? Let's do this. Tristan, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to digging in.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. I'm very excited.
So, since this is our first time getting to know each other, what's the one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
I suppose that depends on who you're talking about, but a lot of people are surprised to learn that I lived in Vietnam.
Oh, for what reason?
I was working for an IT security firm, and this was back during the financial crisis. And there was kind of a moment there when our head of marketing quit. And I had to go over and hire a new head of marketing since I was in charge of marketing for the company. And then while I was there, the general manager of the Vietnam office was fired by the CTO.
Oh.
And so the CTO was planning on moving over to Vietnam and taking over until he could hire a new general manager. And then the CEO fired the CTO. And so I was kind of the last person standing there, and I just kind of like got a little bit stuck there for a while, but I really enjoyed it, and it was kind of wonderful to take over that office and explore a culture that I was not really very familiar with, and take on a large management responsibility in the middle of a kind of crisis situation. So it was a big learning opportunity for me.
I bet it was. Do you feel like you've taken a lot of those lessons forward too? Like maybe not in dealing with crisis, but just in dealing with teams and innovation and a lot of the work that you do?
I'd say so. I mean, that's a pretty unique one because, or perhaps not unique, but unique for me since I'm not currently living in Vietnam. So the few words of Vietnamese I learned are not going to help me in other situations. But there are certain similarities between any management situation and things like that are going to be valuable in any situation. So I'd say absolutely.
So I want to dig into the innovation work that you do with teams and helping them kind of be more lean. You're a lean startup coach. But before we get into the how to do it right, I'm curious, what do you think most teams or even organizations are doing wrong when it comes to innovation?
I, the thing that's been on my mind most recently is just that most organizations don't even really do innovation. Like they think of innovation as something that you kind of do in the last 30 minutes of each day.
Mm.
And teams are not fully dedicated to a project. They're really split and scattered. And inevitably, the innovation part of their job is the last thing that's on anybody's mind. So they have all these aspirations and strategies and different arenas that they're going after, but nobody actually has the time to do the work. So if nobody has time to do the work and it's not being prioritized, then obviously nothing is going to get done.
I want to ask you a question about that because you said the time to do the work. And one of the things that I really struggle with, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is that it's exactly what you just said, actually, that we take innovation, which should be an all the time thing, and we turn it into this point in time exercise. It's either because of this crisis or only, focused towards this certain product or certain people. When I don't know, my belief is that innovation is something, it's about thinking differently about across the board. And I recognize there are specific innovation projects that happen as well. But when you say like they don't have the time, is that because they're saying, oh, well, this is my work and innovation is something separate? Or because really in those projects, we need to actually give people time to do the work?
I think it's both of those things. I mean, there's just the standard human, our human sense of procrastination and addiction to email, which prevents us from not paying attention to like all those notifications that are going off. Even just now, I just made sure to put on do not disturb mode to prevent me from changing screens or anything like that. So there's just that, the sense that we always deal with what's in front of us first, even if it's not the most important thing or the most urgent thing, perhaps. But there's still just the prioritization on a company level of saying you are assigned to this innovation team, and I'm going to put that project in your KPIs or your OKRs or whatever performance review system. Like there is a verbal acknowledgement that innovation is important, but everybody knows that the boss's urgent question about the marketing metrics from last quarter are more important, and you should do that first.
Right.
There's one team I worked with many years ago who had explicitly stated, and this is not a great description of a strategy, but their strategy was growth. Like that was their OKR for the quarter. They said, we need to grow. And so everybody in the company needs to be focused on growth. And it was a small company. It was only about 100 people big. And they did have a growth team that was explicitly targeting that metric, monthly active users. But that growth team had 1 out of 100 people assigned to it. Mm. So, your priorities, your actions express priorities. That's not me saying that. That's a Gandhi quote, right? So if you say your innovation is a priority for you, but you don't actually assign anybody to innovation teams, how much of a priority is it really?
Right. It's not. And actually, in a lot of ways, you're doing worse damage because you're really out of alignment with what you say and what you do, which I think diminishes trust.
Absolutely, right. And trust is so important if you're going to be managing anything.
Yeah. So one of the things you do with Kromatic, which is your company, is I'm so fascinated to like really delve into how this works. So you work with innovation teams to run at least one experiment or research per week to improve their product and business model. Tell me how that works. I want to know how that works, and I want to understand why that's so beneficial.
Okay, so I mean, it's beneficial. Well, let's go from the other way around, right? So the goal of most of these innovation teams is to find a new business model, right? To bring a new product or a new service to the market, ideally a new market, so that the company can expand its offerings and grow, right? And whenever you're doing something that's brand new, there's a certain amount of uncertainty, and uncertainty really equals risk. Like if you charge ahead and just try and build whatever you came up with in your daydreams, there is a high possibility that you are wrong about something, even if it's just being wrong about exactly what customer segment there is or what value proposition there might be or what channels you can use to reach them. our job as an innovation team is not necessarily just to produce a product, but it's really to produce a business model. And a business model in this case is really composed of little chunks of knowledge that can answer those critical questions like who is our customer, what channels can we use? And so when I talk about running experiments or doing research, I'm really talking about going into the market and answering those fundamental questions that we have on a very rapid basis so that we can reduce risk and uncertainty. And so that's really what we're doing. And those experiments, sometimes it's as simple as going outside and talking to your customers or who you think your customers are. Sometimes it's as simple as putting up a Facebook ad with your value proposition and seeing if anybody cares to click. Sometimes it is a bit more involved, and you might have to roll up your sleeves and actually, maybe you're trying to produce a product, but you're going to manually perform a service for somebody to see if you can even figure out how to solve it, how to create good financial projections for somebody, or figure out how to efficiently manage stock in a manual sense before you build the robot that's going to automate that process. These are all things that you can generally do in a very, very rapid basis to answer some of those fundamental questions and basically figure out if the idea is good or not, or maybe it should just be shelved or killed.
I know this is going to sound like a naive question because I wholeheartedly believe in experimentation, but it sounds so obvious that it works. Why don't companies do more of it, or what's the aversion to doing this as a regular process?
There's so many reasons, right? I think fundamentally there's a disconnect between project success and team success. And by that, I mean that when somebody is given an innovation project, whether that's, the business unit manager or the actual team, their goal is told to, like, here's a business plan for 10 million euro, next year, go execute on it. Right? Mm-hmm. So they're being judged on whether or not they can generate 10 million euro. But given that this is a new project and a new market, it's very uncertain. That goal doesn't necessarily make sense. And so what an innovations project should goal would be to tell you whether or not that business plan is actually true or not. Mm-hmm. And if that team can work effectively and efficiently and discover in a few weeks, like a month, that this project is actually a terrible idea and we should not invest $1 million in it, that's actually a win.
Yeah, huge.
That's good, right? Because we can take that $1 million and invest it somewhere else. But that's not how things are framed. Like, people are given these goals of you must generate 10 million euro in revenue. And if that's the goal, then of course, every part of human behavior is going to tell us, all right, how do we get out of this situation as best as possible? Well, I can just CYA and I'll execute the plan that was given to the best of my ability. And if it didn't work, it's the person who wrote the plan, right? It's the business manager. Or I can just work on the project for a little bit of time, and then I'll probably get rotated off this project before it actually launches. Because this project is going to take a year. People rotate jobs once every 6 months. They get reassigned, new priorities
I've
get
heard
done.
that before. It's like, I'm just waiting it out.
Yeah, right. So what's their incentive to actually go and get information and discover that this project is a bad idea? You're just going to be the messenger who goes to your boss and says, boss, your idea sucks. So what's my incentive to do that if I can just wait it out and kind of bide my time and I'll be reassigned? I mean, there's just so many things that are pushing against that, especially in a large corporation where all the processes are really geared towards maintaining the status quo and are not really geared to exploiting or exploring new opportunities.
What I really like, Tristan, about what you're saying, and I hadn't really thought about it in this kind of context before, about that kind of project success versus team success, but this idea that, hey, the next step isn't to prove that we can make $10 million. The next step is to prove whether this is or is not a good idea to really launch. And that makes both outcomes success versus failure, being okay with your failure, which frankly nobody is. We all say we are, but nobody really is at the end of the day.
Right? Nobody likes that, right?
No, it's one of those funny things that everybody talks about loving, but nobody does. And that's okay. Like, I get it. But what you're saying allows the outcome to be a no or a yes, and the lessons valuable along the way.
Yeah. right? And that's why we really focus on that one experiment per week. Now, that's certainly an ideal. Maybe it might be one every 2 weeks. It really depends on the industry you're facing. But that's at least a leading indicator that the team is, doing its job, is going out and getting useful information and insights. Because if we're getting insights, then we would hope that we're going to get an answer to that big question as to whether or not the project is going to be successful or not.
So let me ask you, well, I've got two questions for you, but let me back up for 1 second and ask you, you said reduced risk and uncertainty. Walk me through that. Is that risk just simply the uncertainty itself, or are there other specific things you're looking for to measure, yep, we are reducing risk as we go?
Well, so for our purposes, there is kind of I can roll these dice and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know whether I'm going to, get a 7 and lose immediately, or I'm going to get snake eyes and win. I can't even remember. I don't play that game. Right. So that's risk, right? Uncertainty is like, well, I don't even know what game we're playing. I don't know who's betting against me. I don't know who the competitors are. I don't know who the market is. Like, I don't even know I have a bunch of chips and I don't even know what they're worth. Am I betting $1 million or $10? So that's just a whole lack of information. And there's always going to be some risk going into a project. Right? There will be different things that happen that you just simply can't control. Like, nobody knows what the economy is going to be like. I don't even know what the news stories are going to be like later today. Things are so crazy in the world. But we can go out and get information and reduce the uncertainty as much as possible to try and actually quantify what is the risk that we are taking when we actually launch this project. And is that a risk worth taking? Are we playing poker or are we playing roulette?
Yeah. And roulette's, I don't know about you, but that's not the game I want to play. But the other thing that I find interesting about experimentation is that not only do you minimize the risk, but you actually end up battle testing or optimizing your ideas, your solutions, your product, whatever it is you're working on, because you discover things that you would have never thought of in the R&D room or in the conference room. Do you find that?
Yes, absolutely. And that's always a really fascinating thing, right? Because there's those two general directions that you can approach innovation from, right? There's just being very kind of technology or solution focused and coming up with cool different things, and then trying to figure out what market or what use case you can make with that. Right? And that's probably the most common case of that would be the Post-it note, right? Post-it note was somebody looking for a new type of glue, and they discovered this type of glue that actually wasn't very good at what it was intended for, but you could make really awesome Post-it notes with it. So that's cool. That's more of a product-led innovation that eventually has to find a market. And then there's the very customer-centric, design-centric approach where you fixate on what are the problems that actually need to be solved, what are the jobs that the customer is trying to do, and then figure out what technology you can use for that. And I think they're not mutually exclusive. There is a really good opportunity to do both of those things. And when you're dealing with deep technology companies like material sciences, you have to do some just basic R&D and playing around with things without having any idea what the use case is, but saying like, well, what does this molecule do? Right? But at the end of the day, you have to make the product and the market meet. Right? And so both of those forces need to come into play, and you really need to allow yourself to be surprised at what users actually do with your product. Who would have known that Twitter would turn into what it is, which is it could be good or bad depending on your perspective.
Well, I love how you said that though, like what they actually do with it, because it's so true. You just never know.
No, I mean, who would know that people would use Facebook to organize, Area 51 storming, or counter democracy protests, or pro democracy protests? Like, these are fascinating things. Nobody could have predicted that specifically would happen. But that's what's delightful about innovation. That's where the true stuff comes from. It's really this process of co-creation with the customer.
I want to ask you about, you said one experiment per week, and I know I can visualize our amazing listeners, and I know because I'm having it too, they're out there thinking, okay, that's awesome, but is an experiment something small that I can actually do in a week because I got other stuff to do? Or is an experiment this massive thing? So will you walk us through an example of kind of maybe even with one of your clients of a week by week kind of flow and what those one experiments were so we can understand how they kind of get bitten off one at a time?
Sure. So let's take a very kind of simple example, or let's say that I'm going to create, just staring at my shoes right now. Let's say that I'm going to create shoes that cure plantar fasciitis, right? So they're amazing shoes that cure a medical condition, right? And I'd like to test to see if those shoes will actually help people. But in order to do that, that's going to take a really long time. I've got to do some R&D. I've got to produce some. I've got to recruit some customers to actually try them out. So we're talking about a several months long process. But there are various things that I can do that are much simpler, like while R&D is perhaps working on that. And maybe I can start with the most basic thing, which is if I was to put up an advertisement and try and attract people into my store saying shoes that cure plantar fasciitis, is anybody going to know what on earth plantar fasciitis even means? Right? Does anybody know what those shoes do? If that's my advertisement, if that's my slogan, who's going to come into my store? Or who's going to click on my Facebook ad? And so there's a faster experiment I can do, which is just let me put those words on a Facebook ad and see if anybody clicks. Okay. That's only going to take a week. It's going to take a couple days to make that ad, put it on Facebook, get it approved, drive some traffic, get an answer. But I could even do in an hour, or even right now, I could ask you, hey, would you mind, can you just explain back to me tomorrow, what do you think that means? What are shoes that cure plantar fasciitis? And just please don't use any of those words. So explain it back to me in different words.
Can I do that now? Because here's what I'd say.
Yes, please.
I'd say they're extremely comfortable shoes that I wear for a couple months that cure my foot pain.
Oh, that's actually pretty good. Most people just scratch their heads and stare at me.
Well, I actually I don't have plantar fasciitis, but I do run, so I do know what foot pain feels like.
Exactly right. Okay, so this is actually always fascinating because I run this specific test in workshops sometimes, and I found that everybody in Minnesota knows what I'm talking about.
Oh my gosh!
But nobody in San Francisco or New York.
How funny! Well, Minnesotans are all runners. They're crazy winter runners.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. So everybody's running. So plantar fasciitis, for those that might not know what that is just a specific type of foot pain, which I think is caused by tightened tendons on the bottom of your foot. Right. So the point being, and I obviously picked the wrong example for you in this case.
Sorry.
No worries. That if 9 out of 10 people don't know what plantar fasciitis is, even if they have it, right, then you are immediately losing 90% of your sales.
Right. Well, that's me. That was me because I don't know what it is. I just know it hurts.
Right. Exactly. You know that it hurts. So in your case, I got something which was pretty close, but you might have thought it was for general foot pain when I'm talking about something that's very specifically for runners, right? So frequent runners that have that specific type of foot pain. And so if I'm not explaining my value proposition right, then nobody's going to buy it. And I can test whether or not I'm explaining it right just by going and testing with maybe 1 or 5 people. And I can do that in an hour and get a result.
You know what's interesting about that too, and I realized it as I was saying it, and then you were kind of debriefing, I thought, oh, for me, clearly a couple months is what I'd be willing to give it for it to work. Because I'd said something like that you wear for a couple months. And I bet you get other responses like the minute I put them on my feet, feel better. Other people need instant gratification. So it tells you a little bit about their mindset around it too, like what their product use expectations are.
Absolutely, right. And all of that information is valuable because we'll figure out very, very quickly, is our product actually going to cure that within 1 week or 2 months or anything like that. So you'll get a lot of understanding of, in this case, what your marketing copy implies to people about what your solution is. Also, when you get people to describe your value proposition back to you, you will very often get the words that they will put into Google to find your product. Just so if you describe something like, well, shoes that will cure my foot pain, then I know that I should probably look up the keyword foot pain. So that might be a good way to drive traffic to my product. But anyway, there are all sorts of these really nice qualitative and quantitative insights, just what percentage of people understand what I'm talking about, and then what are the words they use and what do those things apply are nice qualitative insights.
So But just if I hear you right, really, because I was trying to understand what an experiment looks like. An experiment can be very simple. It can be as simple as write a statement describing your product or service and see how people respond, or ask people to respond to something. Could be a Facebook ad if you have some money behind it. Interestingly enough, which is, by the way, what Tough Mudder did when he first launched his business, he did a $6,000 Facebook ad in one event to say, will this fly? And yes. I don't know, what are they valued at now? $6 billion or something like that. So if that tells you anything, but that was his first experiment. But it's chunking it off and kind of, tell me if this is right, but going in a sequential order, meaning let's back up to the beginning. Does anybody even care or know what this is?
Yes, absolutely. Like as simple as possible, right? Because it's very hard to, if you have a very complex experiment, like I'm going to launch this product into the market using these channels and this marketing slogan, then there's so many things that can go wrong and that can impact that experiment that it may have failed, but you don't know why it failed, so you can't fix it. Right? So having something nice and simple with one variable that you're playing with, like, do people understand this? Will people click on this ad? If they put these shoes with a clear hypothesis that is kind of like, if this, then that, is a nice way to divide up your experiments. And to your point, there are certain things which are more important questions to answer first. Like if you don't know who the customer is, then you can't possibly figure out the right marketing channel to reach them. Right? There's just no way. You have to know who the customer is first. So that's a more important question to ask. And we call that our learning goal.
So how long do these experiments typically take with your clients? And I'm guessing there isn't one answer to this.
No, generally it's 1 week. We really do strive for that goal to proceed at a rapid pace. But like I said, certainly there are some experiments which just take a longer time, maybe take some time to build. I'm working on a side project right now, and we're kind of operating on 2-week iterations. But even then, you can sometimes stagger those iterations. So you're launching an experiment 1 week, and then while you're waiting for the data to collect, you can work on a parallel path. But once a week is a really good cadence to target. If you're going slower than once every 2 weeks, it's probably the case that your experiments are too large and that they could be simplified. So there's some neat ways to break them down further.
So let's say I have an idea for a new revenue stream, a product or a B2B service, whatever. How much overall time should I be allotting for an experiment a week? Is there an endpoint? I mean, I know we're always learning, but to start to, like, to your point earlier about, like, yes or a no, we shouldn't do this as a success. How long do you think it takes to get to there? And again, this too, I'm not sure there's one answer.
I actually think that's an amazing question, because that's really leading into the idea of, venture capital or how do we invest in these projects?
Yeah.
Because there's, interestingly enough, like venture capital does this very well. They say very clearly, and angel investors as well, they say, well, I'm willing to invest, the group of us, we're willing to invest $50,000 in this project. That $50,000 would probably last you maybe 6 months, maybe a year. But after that, you better show us some information, some project traction that shows this idea is good or not. And so typically the funding is broken up into several small pieces. And in larger companies, they typically have the problem is that they don't do things like that, and they will invest, a $4 million budget in a project that is going to last 4 years. So they don't get any feedback as to whether or not it's a good idea until the end of that multi-year period.
Yeah.
But that is also how entrepreneurs function, which is not so smart. Like if I have a project or you have a project, we will tend to just say, well, I'm just going to invest some time in this.
Yeah.
And we don't really give ourselves a hard deadline as to when we expect an answer or what is the criteria for investing more time. And so the idea there is that we really should be setting some sort of a pivot or persevere moment, which represent this is the amount of time, money, and sweat and blood that I'm investing in this project. And if I don't have a good answer to, what my customer acquisition costs after this investment, I'm going to stop because it's not working.
I love that language, by the way, pivot or persevere.
It's not mine. That's Eric. But Eric Reed wrote the Lean Startup book.
Yeah.
Nice, really nice phrases.
But I feel like that applies to a lot of things and a lot of projects that we do in general, not just new product ideas, but just in general, the things that we do, at some point you have to ask yourself, is this worth continuing on or not? Across all the greater scope of your business. Before we run out of time, I know I dug really deep into experiments because I find that fascinating. And I hope for all of us on Launch Street that we really pay attention to how do we build experiments into our workflow? Because I do think, Tristan, what you're saying is so important in terms of reducing risk and optimizing what you're doing. And it's not, that's why I wanted to ask you about the one experiment, because the reality is it's not that complicated or hard. In fact, it shouldn't be to test one variable at a time. And see and learn kind of from there versus, to your point, like, here's $10 million, go, or yes, this is your priority, now go, which is what we tend to do. But I want to I want to ladder it back up to ecosystems, because you talk a lot about that in your work. And you talk about how kind of teams or companies are like these living, breathing systems, like an ecosystem. So will you talk more about that?
I mean, that's really, if you start looking. Well, so I work with large companies, but I also work currently and have worked with government agencies that are looking at increasing innovation over a geographic region. And there are some real kind of almost obvious patterns that you see after you work with a number of those different regions. And those patterns are very much replicated in large companies. And they are just the things that we've been discussing today. So, nobody in the company has innovation as one of their KPIs or OKRs. If like that, I would consider that a function of apathy, right? And if everybody views innovation as not their job and they're apathetic towards it, then you're going to get fewer people in your system proposing ideas or even bothering to say them out loud. So looking for obstacles like that are very consistent in your environment can really help you unlock innovation for a large region. And if you compare things like the innovation that happens in Silicon Valley to the innovation that happens, I guess I'll pick on Vietnam since we were talking about it earlier, there's just obviously a wide range of difference there. Although the Vietnamese, for the record, are pretty amazing and industrious, but they don't have quite the same level of technology innovation that's happening in Silicon Valley. Right? So you really have to look at and understand what are the factors that are helping or hindering innovation in your company or in your region. And sometimes it is very, very simple, like saying, 7 years ago, there was no venture capital in Estonia. There was just a few angel investors starting to band together. They call themselves startup wise guys. That was one of the first accelerators there. And trying to fix that problem because they recognized that there was a problem in Estonia overall and they thought that they could solve it. Or it can be something as simple as saying, well, in Serbia, there were a lot of great B2B startups, but Voja Lalic, I'm probably pronouncing his name poorly, recognized that they didn't have the sales skills. So they said there is a skill gap in this ecosystem where we know technology, but we're unable to sell it into the EU. So let's bring in some people, let's bring in some good sales trainers, and let's help our ecosystem, our entrepreneurs learn that skill, and we'll hopefully get past it. Right, so ecosystem is really looking systematically at the things that are blocking the innovation funnel as a whole in a region or a corporation or an organization, and trying to systematically chip away and remove those things.
So if I'm in a large team or I lead a large team, what are the indicators that my ecosystem is out of balance?
So they're typically really obvious. The first thing is just how much innovation is actually happening, right? How many ideas are being proposed? And the first thing I would look at if you're in a large org is, are all of those ideas coming from the same people, which is typically top down, right? If that's the case, probably 90% of the brain power of your organization is not contributing to the innovation effort. That's a very obvious factor. The other things you can look at that are super simple and easy to do is the team composition. So do we have any teams that are actually kind of what I would consider a complete team, meaning that they're cross-functional and that you have all the skill sets necessary to create a small test or prototype or experiment and bring it to market? And so out of the teams we have, like say you have 10, how many people actually have a marketing person, a salesperson, an R&D person, and so on and so forth? If they don't have that, you probably have an issue. And then lastly, I would just look at the percentage of those projects which actually have pivot or persevere meetings kind of on the books. that's a good indicator as to whether or not you are making decisions or not, whether or not these are just, projects, or whether they're truly innovation projects where you're trying to generate an option to go into a market, and you're generating the information which will help you decide if that option is a good one or a bad one.
That's interesting. I want to go back to the first one you said about the top down. I find that fascinating too, because it always blows my mind how willing we are to take innovation from 6 people and leave the other 1,000 out. And why wouldn't we tap the other 1,000 in our organizations?
Yeah.
It blows my mind, actually.
Yeah, it is kind of funny because there are so many people that are on that know the customer because they're dealing with the customer every day. I just got an innovation survey that somebody ran that was suspiciously limited to only this is not my phrase, they said white collar employees. And I was like, what's wrong with everybody else? Like, they're the people actually talking to the customers. Don't you think they might have an idea as to what the customer wants?
Right. Well, and it's funny. I heard, is her name Kat Cole? Sorry if the name is wrong. She was the CEO and president of Cinnabon. I think she's now all of whatever the holding company is. But I saw her speak once, and she was talking about how their idea for Cinna Sticks came from her doing a tour across the country and going to the different Cinnabons, which are in malls all across America, and talking to a part-time, college kid who manned the counter a couple days a week and was saying, people don't stop and eat anymore. We need something more portable. And kind of that is where that innovation came from that really helped transform their business, which wasn't doing as hot because people don't stop and eat a Cinnabon anymore. You need a whole table just to fit the Cinnabon. So so to your point, right? Like, why wouldn't you talk to the people who actually do the work and talk to the customer every day? It kind of blows my mind about that. But I want to...
You said something else that was really interesting there, which is that typically the managers think that coming up with an idea means coming up with the solution, whereas that person who was working in a store maybe didn't have a solution, but he recognized the problem.
Right. And what a great piece of input right there.
Yeah. Like, that's the idea. You don't need an idea of the solution. You just need an idea of what problems should we be solving.
That's a great point. I think oftentimes we're actually solving the wrong problem because we're looking at from the conference room out, not the consumer in.
Yes, exactly. And it goes back to that R&D versus customer-centric approach. R&D is valuable. It's great to play around with dough and figure out what shapes you can turn it into. But you also need to go from the other direction and figure out what customer problems are most urgent.
So I wanted to ask you a quick question about an article that you wrote, and the title or the main topic of it was the difference between kind of strategy of innovation versus innovation strategy. Will you just talk a little bit about what you mean by that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
I think that's just kind of a pet peeve of mine, in that very often people say, our strategy as a company is to innovate. Like, that's going to lead us into the future. In some cases, the strategy involves making decisions, like we are going to invest in Europe as opposed to America. But it also involves giving a heuristic to the people who are actually on the ground doing these innovations to help them make decisions in their tactical day-to-day work. So if you just say that our strategy is to innovate, that's not helpful. What we need is a strategy of where and how you're going to innovate. Like, what is the process? Are you going to use metered funding? Like, what are the size and length of those pivot or persevere decisions and investments that you're making? How many investments are you going to make? How are you going to clear up the time for people to actually invest in those projects? These are the things that we really need. And very often it's kind of swept under the rug in a brand and just some ridiculous public statement of how amazing Blockbuster's innovation department is, without actually saying what we should be doing.
Right. And what I think is also fascinating about that is, and I laughed a little when I saw that title, just because I agree with you. I just think that oftentimes we say, well, we're going to innovate. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Where, how, what resources are you going to use? What are you trying to accomplish? Because that's really ultimately what I think the strategy should be, is where are you trying to go? And then you can work backwards into how you innovate to get there. But we usually do it the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, it really should be that you have some insight as to what the future should be. Like, we have a vision. Like, Google has a vision that a clear vision that the future has going to have more data, that the amount of data that we are producing and consuming is doubling, if not quadrupling every year. So based on that vision of the future, they see a hole in that vision, right? There's going to be a problem with people being able to process and find the information that's relevant for you. And therefore, the product and what they need to do to get there is a little bit more clear. Like they know the problem, they know which direction they need to head, they know what the future looks like. So we know we got to start walking this way. But if you don't have a real clear vision of the future and you're just saying, well, let's just go innovate, you're really just saying that you have no vision, you have no thesis. And so it's not helpful for the people on the ground. Like they're going to start coming up with these random projects like Uber for hamburgers. And it turns out you're a materials company and nobody in your team wants to invest in that project. So help the people in your company by telling them which areas you think are actually growing, which things you think are fruitful, which areas of opportunity actually overlap with the company's core competencies. And then let's go in that direction.
Which I think loops back to what you were saying at the very beginning when I was asking you about what are they doing wrong. When we're that ambiguous about innovation, we get that mindset of I'll just wait it out. I'm not going to be here to the end of it. I'll just put my head down and do my work. Kind of all the apathy, the things you were talking about in the very beginning.
Spot on. I couldn't say it better.
All right. So before we close, where can people go to learn more and connect with you?
Well, you can always go to Kromatic.com. That is my kind of that is my company's website, but I also blog at grasshopperherder.com. Or you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn, but please send me a note because random invitations are very confusing for me.
Well, LinkedIn has become a little bit of a cluster of random invitations.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I hope they find a way to rein it in. That's a different story. We'll also have to talk another time about why grasshopper herder, but for another time. All right. My final question to you is what's your final piece of advice for innovators out there that want to start building a leaner, more experimental process into their work?
Okay. So for actual innovators working on innovation projects, my one biggest suggestion would be to get an agreement before you start the project as to what success looks like. If you can agree with your boss that it's not just ROI after 4 years, but it's the information that will lead you to a good go, no go, or pivot or persevere decision. That is going to be the most helpful thing, because if you don't have that agreement beforehand and you just start running experiments and you go up to your boss at the end of the day and say, your idea sucks, they are not going to take that message very well. So make it very clear as to what success looks like and try and make sure that success means making good decisions as opposed to just delivering ROI.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I was about to loop it back to your point earlier about the yes or no is just as good as, making the $1 million. Tristan, thank you so much. That was a great piece of advice to end on. And yes, clarity in the beginning is so important and knowing what you're really trying to accomplish. So thank you for coming on Launch Street. This was fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad we were able to make this work.
Thanks for hanging with us on Inside Launch Street. If you know someone that is truly ready to unlock their innovation advantage, have them join you on Launch Street. Discover your innovation advantage. Build a team of high-performing innovators and ignite ideas and solutions that create massive impact. GOTO, launchstreet.com. Remember, innovators, if you don't take the leap, somebody else will.